welcome to the show where we share the stories of the many who intersect with our healthcare system but are rarely heard from. My name is Kevin Poe, founder and editor of Kevin MD. Today on the show, we have Kerry Evers. She's a psychologist and she wrote the Kevin MD article, "With Lynch Syndrome, Knowledge Alone Isn't Power." Kerry, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here.
We'll get into your article in a little bit, but first off, can you share your story and journey to where you are today?
Sure. So I am a behavior change specialist. I'm a psychologist by training, but not one who has a couch in my office. And what I do is I actually run a company that helps to increase people's well-being, help them change their behavior in many different ways. It started off with a lot of health behavior change, such as smoking and weight management, stress management, but we also work in the area of financial well-being and emotional and mental well-being, social well-being. So we develop programs for people that other organizations can implement, many times through computer or coaches or counselors. So I first got my start in this area by doing cancer prevention. And my family had a very strong history of cancer. But at one point, my cousin was diagnosed with a very advanced colon cancer. And unlike many of our other relatives who had been diagnosed early, including his father, who had passed away in his early 40s, someone picked up on the fact that this was more than just hereditary or kind of a something that ran in our family, and found out that he in fact had what's called Lynch syndrome. And he, before he passed away, asked all of the cousins to make sure that we had been tested. So I, working in the healthcare industry, I waited a little bit. I waited for things like the GINA Act, the Genetic Information Non-Disclosure Act, to be passed. I looked into a lot of things, read academic journals, and eventually did get tested and found out that I too had the genetic mutation at MLH1, which is one of the forms of Lynch syndrome. And one of the things I like to say to people is a lot of us have heard about genetic breast cancer, BRCA, ovarian cancer. Lynch syndrome is much less known. It's becoming more and more, but with Lynch syndrome, you are predisposed to about 12 different types of cancer. Colon cancer is the most common, and you tend to develop them at a much younger age. And often you have primary cancer, many primary cancers over a lifetime. As an example, my father has had 4 primary cancers and is still alive and doing very well. It's been a journey, and I'm thrilled that I have connected with a lot of other people who have Lynch. I'm what many people call a previvor, meaning that I know I have a genetic predisposition, but I do not have cancer. I've never been diagnosed with cancer. But because of my genetic predisposition, I undergo many, many, many tests a year, many invasive tests, and have also had to have prophylactic surgery, such as hysterectomies. And some people in my family have had parts of their colon removed before they're diagnosed with cancer. So that is kind of where I'm at. I was able to combine both my academic life and my personal life and do a lot now in terms of helping other genetic cancer previvors, help them get through kind of the brainstorm that is, going through all these tests and wondering if, the next time you go into the doctor, you're going to find out you have cancer.
And you talk more about your story in the Kevin MD article, "With Lynch Syndrome, Knowledge Alone Isn't Power." Now, you mentioned your family member that was diagnosed with cancer. And what was it about that cancer that made the physician team suggest potential Lynch syndrome?
Yeah, it was a very astute physician that we were all very thankful for. It was because he was diagnosed very early. So early in terms of his age, not in terms of the stage of the cancer. His father had had 2 primary cancers around the same age, pancreatic and colon. And other people in our family, including my father, had been diagnosed with colon cancer in their 40s. At that time, so we're talking 15 years ago, colon cancer was not as prevalent in individuals in that age group. Nowadays, it is becoming more and more common for younger individuals to have colon cancer. Some of those are due to genetic predispositions, others are just lifestyle or, just happens. But at the time, the physician said, we really need to look into genetic testing, did a full panel of genetic tests, and that's when the Lynch syndrome was found.
You mentioned other cancers other than colon cancer is associated with Lynch syndrome. What are some of the other common ones?
Pretty much anything in your gut. That's one way to say, but colon, rectal, small bowel, pancreatic, liver, urinary. For women, it includes pretty much all of your ovarian. Breast cancer is starting to be looked into. There are some who say it is part of Lynch syndrome, others who do not. It's, to be determined. Certain forms of skin cancer, brain cancer, bladder cancer. So it's quite a list. Now, some of them, like colon cancer, it is a very high risk. Others, brain cancer, it's a little bit higher than the general population, but not so much that, like, as an example, I do not have brain cancer all the time, because in my family, that's not one of the cancers that was prevalent. For my family, it's been more pancreatic and colon.
And when people with Lynch syndrome get diagnosed with colon cancer, you mentioned they are a younger cohort. About how young?
A lot of people say it's typically in your 40s. Now, as you get older, the risk becomes more. So through your lifetime, if you have Lynch syndrome, depending upon the specific mutation, so I mentioned I'm MLH1, there's 4 other mutations, but in our lifetime, it's about an 80% risk of getting colon cancer. So it's pretty high. It also tends to be multiple primary. So many people have multiple primary colon cancers. So not a reoccurrence, but it's actually a new form of cancer, and they tend to be very aggressive. One of the benefits of knowing that you have Lynch syndrome, and most of the time, if they take out a polyp or they find cancer in your colon, they will test it to see if it is as a result of Lynch syndrome. There are different forms of therapies that they will use. Immunotherapies are becoming very important, but the way you get treated is a little bit different than if it's not related to a Lynch syndrome diagnosis.
And how is Lynch syndrome?
It's a 50-50 chance. If one of your parents has Lynch syndrome, you have a 50-50 chance of also having Lynch syndrome. So, and if you have 2 parents, then obviously your risk goes up a little bit, and that's a little bit of a different diagnosis. Because of that, one of the most important things that I can recommend to physicians, to clinical staff, but also to individuals is, if you have a strong hereditary cancer, or your family has a lot of cancer in your family, think about the potential of getting tested for different genetic conditions. And it's not just Lynch syndrome. There's a lot of other ones that are now being diagnosed and being identified as we become more attuned to genetic sequencing. But talking to your family, understanding what other people in your family have had. Colon cancer is not the type of cancer people talk about readily. You don't typically just start up a conversation about your last colonoscopy. It's not a comfortable conversation, but it's really important to know that family history, because then you can talk to your care providers and really determine if maybe genetic testing is necessary, or maybe just increasing your surveillance of colonoscopies, endoscopies is important for you. And that's one of my main messages, is communication about family history is so important.
So I want to go back to your genetic test. You received the result from the clinical care team. Tell me what happened next after you received the results.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, I went into it thinking I knew a lot. I did all of my academic research. I was in graduate school for a long time. I had a friend with me. They had told me I had to have someone with me. They also called me ahead of time and said they wanted to have a student in the room because they wanted to learn how to give results. At that point, I knew that I was definitely positive, because I just picked up on the fact that they wanted a genetic counselor student in the room with me. The big thing is, for me, a lot of the new genetic testing is being done remotely. You can get, genetic tests through just those over-the-counter internet-based testing kits. And for me, even though I had good knowledge, it's still a blow. It is still very emotional. It's tough to take in, and you have a lot of questions. How is this going to affect my insurance? What do I need to see a specialist? What does it mean for, employment? Can it be used against me in terms of employment and insurance? What does it mean for my family? What about my fertility? All sorts of questions. And I think if you just get those in paper, or if you get them through a portal and you don't have any context, you don't have someone to kind of give you a bit of a guide, the first thing most people do is go to the internet, which can be a wonderful source of information. It can also be a really scary source of not correct information. So I really advocate for people to talk with a genetic counselor, talk to a physician or care team member who has knowledge of genetic cancer so that they can really just at least start you on that journey so that it doesn't overwhelm you with emotion and fear.
So one thing you mentioned was the association with your employer and your diagnosis. And one thing that you did mention was the Genetic Non-Discrimination Act, which is
Correct.
one of the reasons why you waited before taking the test. Tell us more about that act.
Yeah, so the GINA protects individuals from their genetic information being used in terms of employment or medical insurance. It is something to keep your eye on. It's, you know, acts like this can change and new laws or new regulations can be put in place. Currently, you cannot be discriminated against based upon genetic information from employment or from your medical insurance. However, long-term care and life insurance can deny you coverage because of genetic information. Other specialty types of insurance can potentially use that if they have that information. So one of the things when I talk to people, before you go to get tested, talk to your genetic counselor, talk to someone who knows in the area. There might be things you might want to do before you get tested, things you might want to get put in place on the off chance that you do test positive for some sort of genetic mutation. And I did want to mention that latest estimates are that 1 in 279 individuals do carry a genetic mutation related to Lynch syndrome. That's a really high number. Having this mutation does not mean you're going to get cancer. So there are many people who will never know that they have this mutation. However, if you do have it and you know it, there are things you can do. You can protect yourself. As I mentioned, my father is a 4-time cancer survivor. He's living a great life. He's in his mid-70s. He's doing great. And that's because he had the knowledge and was able to really seek prevention, surveillance, and then appropriate treatment when needed.
We're talking to Kerry Evers. She's a psychologist, and she wrote the Kevin MD article, With Lynch Syndrome, Knowledge Alone Isn't Power. Kerry, what's one thing that your clinical care team did well, and what's one thing that you think that they could have improved?
One of the best things was that they admitted, I live in Rhode Island, and at the time, there were not any specialists in Rhode Island who dealt with Lynch syndrome. And the genetic counselor in Rhode Island said to me, you should really seek a cancer center, and gave me references there. So I started receiving all of my surveillance and care at Dana-Farber, which has been wonderful. A lot of that has changed. A lot more physicians and care teams are aware of Lynch syndrome and are able to help you manage it. So you don't necessarily have to seek out a cancer center, but having someone help you kind of hold your hand a little bit, point you in the right direction is really, really helpful. One of the things I might change about how it was delivered to me and how I went through is that they had kind of given me hints over the phone that I had tested positive. And I picked up on those. And that's one of the reasons why I'm so passionate about making sure that people, when they receive this news, have the appropriate context, have the appropriate supports in place, because it really can be a distressing time to get this information, and really helping people to increase their resilience as they're going through some of these programs, the many tests you have to go through. And this is for any type of genetic medical information you might receive. But I think I would have loved to have been told that this is not a death sentence. This is knowledge. With the right context and information and support, it's something that can be managed, and just really that all it is helping you to manage your health in a better way.
For those who are interested in finding more about Lynch syndrome, what kind of resources do you recommend?
Yeah, there's a lot of support groups online, but there's 2 groups in particular. Alive and Kickin' is a nonprofit organization that is run by Robin and Dave Dubin, D-U-B-I-N. They run a support and registry and all sorts of information specific for Lynch syndrome individuals. In addition, Force, which was originally developed specifically for BRCA and other types of genetic cancers, has now expanded to include all sorts of hereditary cancer syndromes and genetic cancer syndromes. And they do have a lot of support for individuals with Lynch, support for clinicians who are looking for information on Lynch and how to help their own patients, and providers who would like to provide counseling. In addition, they also have a registry of clinical trials that are available for people who might be interested in getting involved in that.
And my final question, what are some of your take-home messages that you want to leave with the Kevin MD audience?
Yeah, I in terms of pulling together both my professional and my personal life with Lynch syndrome, with any of these diagnoses or identifications of specific genetic mutations, a lot of it is about behavior change, and that's an area that I work in. I have a new podcast called The Behavior Change Architect, but a lot of this is about encouraging people to talk to their care team, get the appropriate information, know how to weed out the non-information that may not be helpful, and then really making sure you're on top of your surveillance and get support where you need it. Talk to other people who have a similar diagnosis, talk to your family members, make sure that you're telling people about what's happening because it most likely affects them as well, not only in terms of supporting you, but in terms of their own health.
Kerry, thank you so much for sharing your time and insight. And thanks again for being on the show.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.